first month of October, creeps and grave hunters. If you couldn't tell, I really love Halloween and I am so excited that it's Halloween month. It's here. Maybe some normalcy will fall upon all of us, but we don't know. But we are going to have fun here because this, my friends, this is the first week of our Spooky History mini-series. And I couldn't be more excited to share this with you guys because, as promised, for the month of October, I will be bringing you guys the spooky historical history to some of your favorite horror legends and movies and books. And I say yours because you guys are the ones that are voting on them. And this week was actually a really close call between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein. But if you couldn't already tell, Frankenstein won by just a hair, which means next week, I will be bringing you guys the history and origins of your favorite, split personality psychopath. But before we do that, help me have a great day by slamming that like button so more people can see this and the algorithm actually likes me for once. That would be swell. We are about to dive into the Regency period, which is a subpart of the Georgian era, like the very tail end of it, right before we get into the Victorian era. A lot of crazy stuff's going on when Frankenstein is written. We're gonna get into it. Before we do that, you know the drill. Go to my TikTok, go to my Instagram if you haven't already, and get this week's Spooktail recipe for my monster maker. This is my cheeky version of a Boilermaker, pumpkin beer, yummy little treats in here that you have to go to those places to find out what it is, but let's have a sip. Chin chin. Ooh. It's festive, it's yummy, it's a little naughty, which is how I like my drinks. Let's do it, guys. Let's get spooky. Chin chin, spooky week, Halloween month, Frankenstein. Uh-oh. Okay. So off the bat, we need to get some things straight about Frankenstein because Frankenstein's name is not Frankenstein. Frankenstein refers to Dr. Victor Frankenstein, the man who created the monster, which is what he's called, monster, creature, or fiend. But also, we need to realize that Frankenstein, or modern Prometheus, as it's also called depending on the edition, came out of the mind of a woman dealing with horrible trauma, depression, loneliness, possibly debating if she'd made horrible life choices. And you can't tell the origin story of Frankenstein without first delving into the childhood and life of its true creator, Mary Shelley. The author of our beloved horror story was born Mary Wollstonecraft Goodwin. That is such a hard word for me to say, but whatever. Her father and her mother were both really highly prestigious people. Her father was William Goodwin, philosopher, incredible writer, revered by all. And her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, she was also a writer and a groundbreaking feminist. And I just want to put that in perspective because this is the 1790s, which is unbelievable that not only you have a feminist, but you have her be very well renowned in the 1790s. Unfortunately, because again, as I always say, life is life. Mary's mother dies due to childbirth complications not long after Mary is born, Mary and Mary. We need to talk about the fact that how dangerous pregnancy and childbirth is. Okay, she dies, a lot of people still die. Okay, it's risky business. Why we're not talking about that, how that risky it is unbelievable to me. It's terrifying to me. But she passed away. So now you have just William, Mary, and Mary's half-sister, who's actually older than her, obviously, this girl named Fanny, who, this is interesting, she was the product of an affair her mother had on her father, which you could absolutely argue says so much about William that not only does he stay with his wife who has cheated on him, he stays with her and takes care of the child that came out of said affair. I might be jumping to conclusions, but it really does sound like fundamentally Mary was born into a very enlightened and progressive for the time household. William did remarry though to yet another woman named Mary, there's way too many Marys, who by all accounts was pretty much disliked by everybody, especially who would become Mary Shelley. And she also brought her own kids with her, including a young girl named Claire, who Mary actually got along really well with, like really, really well. You'll see in just a moment. And that's amazing to me, just because this woman, Mary, her stepmother, her little wicked stepmother, sent Claire to proper school, but decided, you know, I don't think Mary doesn't need a proper education. She can stay home with my daughter. I mean, it's like Cinderella, okay? But it's not like Cinderella, because truthfully, you could argue that her stepmother stonewalling her from getting a proper education was a blessing, because it meant Mary got to hang out at home in the Goodwin household, which was constantly full of poets and philosophers and intellectuals that all were coming to study underneath her father. He was so well renowned. He had a lot of like apprentices and people that would come to spend time in the Goodwin household. So not only was she exposed to like everything at a very young age, she had to pick the minds of all of these fascinating, you know, brains in her house. And she had access to her father's unbelievably extensive library. So she ends up becoming this prolific writer at a very young age. She even published a novel with her father's company when she was basically a kid. And she's self-taught, but she was so freaking intelligent. It's so admirable. It's also during this time that she finds a way to channel all of her inner angst, anger, depression from her life scenarios and translate it into a page. And, you know, all artists, I think we all know, unfortunately, one of the greatest creative motivators and inspirations comes from pain. And that is something that Mary absolutely will demonstrate throughout our whole history lesson here today. But here's one of my favorite things about her youth that I just think is so, of course I would love this. You guys will understand why. So she would take her father's books from his library and she would bring them to her mother's grave at the old St. Pancras churchyard and read them there. And of course, when I was in London last autumn, I had to go visit the graveyard. It's unbelievable. It's beautiful. Thomas Hardy's tree is also there with all the gravestones around the tree. It's an unbelievable place. Things start to get real spicy though in 1814. Mary's like 16 or 17. She's pretty freaking independent. She's traveled to Scotland to visit family, friends a few times on her own. And she's back in London now. She's at home. She's like mingling with all the people coming to stay with her father. And then to study with her father, in walks a striking, sexy, open-minded Percy Shelley. A poet who instantly sweeps Mary off her feet, except, here's the caveat, he's not only married, but he's got a daughter. But if historical dramas have taught us anything, folks, it's that forbidden love, well, you know, it's the best love. And they fall deeply in love, and he's feeding her the old, you know, lines of, my marriage is loveless, and nobody can make the sun rise like your face can. Clearly, that's not an actual quote, but you get the gist. They fall in love, they're arranging secret rendezvous, and William, her father, he's not an idiot, and he's like, this dude's married, he's got a kid, my daughter is young, but she's of marrying age because this is like 1814, so, you know, 17, you're verging on spinster. And if people know that she's having an affair with a married man, like, that's not going to get her married to a respectable man. So he's like, hell no, hell no, hell no, hell no, kabosh, kabosh, kabosh. Stop messing with my daughter. And because they're young and in love and stupid, arguable, they decide to run away. Because, you know, to hell with it. We're in love. We want to be together. He's not happy in his marriage. Apparently, screw his daughter. And they run away to the continent. They run away to Europe together, except in this very strange novel scenario that is actually happening in real life, they do something that wouldn't be written in a book. They bring along her half-sister Claire. For a few months, they're living this really sexy bohemian life. They're traveling Europe. You know, they're journaling every day. They're discovering their own literary voices. They're probably having a lot of sex. In fact, I know they were having a lot of sex because when money dries up and they have to return to London, Mary's pregnant and she's really, really sick. And this is kind of when the rose-colored glasses come off her situation, okay? She feels horrible. she's pregnant. They have no money. She's trying to stay positive because she's with the man she loves, except the man she loves is almost never there. He's now going to go visit his wife because he's still married, and he's going to go visit her, do God knows what, because he won't divorce her because he knows it'll ruin her. And this woman hates Mary. She actually confronted Mary at one point and was like, stay away from my husband. Please, we have a kid. I need him. Can't blame her. But then also, and I know a lot of this because there was extensive journals at the time. This is speculation, however, and there are not journal entries because a lot of them went missing during this time to corroborate this. But a lot of people think it's also very possible that Percy and Claire, her half-sister, were also carrying on an affair, which sounds a little gross, sounds a little crappy. However, if you consider this is a man that up and left his wife no problem, and he keeps running off with Claire and spending considerable amounts of time with her alone, leaving his pregnant woman at home feeling awful, it's plausible, right? Like, it's a little plausible. Also, there's a new dude in the mix, this guy named Thomas Hogg, a fellow biographer, philosopher, journalist, and he's hanging with the group. You know, he's kind of there for Mary. In fact, things get real bad because she ends up losing her child. The baby is born, her little daughter is born 2 months premature and dies 2 weeks after. She's distraught, like absolutely distraught, as any mother would be, especially because she's like 18 or 19 at this time. I think she's 18. And Percy's kind of like, oh, that sucks. Like, he was just kind of flippant about it. Like, there was no emotion behind it, which I can't even imagine what that would be like. And she ends up kind of confiding in Thomas Hogg, who's always there. And Percy's totally cool with it. In fact, he's kind of like, go talk to Thomas about these problems. Like, in fact, I kind of asked him to be here for you. Like, if maybe you want a piece. If you want a piece, like, go have a piece. He's a piece you can have. Because here's the thing about Percy. From what we know about him, from his journals and whatnot, we know he kind of fancied himself like, you know, an open guy. And not in a way, like a poly way, okay? Like, actually thought, well, we shouldn't be restrained and be with one person. Let's just be open. Like, in his mind with Mary, he's like, oh, we can just be with whoever we want to be, but we love each other, but I can be with whoever I want to be. Except he didn't clue her into that, okay? This isn't like an open relationship. This isn't a poly relationship. He's just actively kind of cheating on everybody around her and abandoning her in her absolute hour of need. But she only wants him. She doesn't want Thomas Hogg. He's a cool friend, cool, whatever. Sure, thanks, bro. But she wants Percy. Thomas falls for her. It's not reciprocated, so he pieces, and she's just kind of left alone, hoping Percy finds his way back to her. But a lot of trauma happens first. Shortly after Mary loses her child, her half-sister Fanny, who she grew up with, committed suicide. Not long after that, Harriet, Percy's wife, drowns herself, probably because she's been abandoned by Percy. So obviously none of this is good. Flash forward a bit, Mary is now healthy. She has recovered from the traumatic childbirth and accident. And Percy is, in a way, as they would say, he's drinking like a fish. He can't stop drinking. They don't have the money really to support his drinking habits, but he's drinking. And he's presumably drinking because, you know, perhaps it's guilt for abandoning his wife and her killing herself. Perhaps it's guilt that he wasn't there emotionally for Mary when they lost their child. Or maybe he was actually more tore up about it than he let on. Maybe he was drinking because he felt horrible that he wasn't bringing in money and he wasn't supporting family, and this woman had left her life to be with him. And basically he just, like, you know, folded his deck of cards everywhere he went, is kind of screwing everybody's life up. But there was a moment when they kind of decided, like, okay, London isn't making us happy. Let's go do the thing that makes us happy. Let's go travel. How they afforded it, I have no idea. But again, they brought Claire along and they went back to travel Europe. And it's an interesting journey they go on because ultimately they are going to end up in a little house, maybe it's a big house, I'm not sure, in the Swiss Alps with Lord Byron, who is a man of, well, he's layered. But some interesting things happen first. important to note that Mary and Percy are now officially wed. They were free to wed because he was now a widower because his wife killed herself. So now Mary is officially Mary Shelley, the name we all know her by. They're in Germany. This is where our story kicks off, folks. They're in Germany. They're in Darmstadt. I'm German, I don't know how to speak German, so whatever. They're in Darmstadt, I think that's how it's said. And that's where Frankenstein Castle is, guys. That's a real place, Frankenstein Castle. It means like stone of the Germans or something. And there's a local legend of the philosopher and alchemist and occultist who was born and lived in the castle, a man named Dr. Dipple, who was alive a century previous. And there's a local legend that talks about how he tried to reanimate flesh. This is an interesting thing because now in the 19th century, that's something that a lot of scientists are really intrigued by, this idea of like, can we use electricity to reanimate limbs, and how does a body, even after death, react to electricity? So this is something that actually Percy and Mary were both really fascinated by. And so the fact that they are in a city or town underneath a castle, or visiting a castle in which there is this legend that pertains to this mad scientist who is doing these experiments. And of course, there's no historical evidence at all that actually say he was up in this castle, you know, trying to animate dead corpses, using a weird mixture of chemicals and whatnot. But we do know that he did like to dissect and do strange experiments with animals. That is a fact. So the fact that later on, when we get to the fact when Mary starts writing Frankenstein, perhaps that, amongst many other things, is why she chose to have Frankenstein's monster be made out of animal parts and bones instead of just human. Something to think about. But so they're traveling, and ultimately, like I said, end up in the Swiss Alps, in this house with Lord Byron in the middle of a horrendous storm. This is not a fun time for Mary. Percy is just being a drunken buffoon. At this time, we still don't know if he had a thing going on with Claire, but we definitely know he is drunk all of the time. And like I said, Lord Byron is Lord Byron. And Claire, her half-sister, falls in love with him stupidly. Like so many women fell in love with Lord Byron for God knows what reason. But Mary, she's not drinking, she's not having a good time, because guess what? The woman's pregnant, okay? And she doesn't want to be there. She wants her husband to be her husband. She wants to leave, but nobody can leave because there's a horrible storm. It's the middle of, I think, winter. So they're freaking stuck. So in order to pass the time, Byron and Shelley come up with an idea of like, let's hold a contest of who can write the best ghost story. Who can scare? I mean, it's a camp on crack, right? During this one particular night, the lightning's crashing. Mary has this vision, this waking dream, as she calls it, of an 8-foot tall man monster comprised of various different corpse parts stitched together, being reanimated by galvanization. And she just wrote and wrote and wrote. And that is how the birth of Frankenstein happened. She wrote this really tragic tale, and admittedly gruesome, of a monster created by a man with no purpose, who never was meant to feel yet did, and was lonely and was denied everything. And it makes you wonder, like, who is the monster, the creature or the creator? It's not shocking that she would write something so emotional, because the woman was going through a freaking lot. She's pregnant. She's probably thinking about her last pregnancy. She's thinking about birth and death. To her, her entire life is a constant pattern of birth also bringing death. Her own birth killed her mother. Her first pregnancy ended with death. What would this bring? So much death came from the relationship between her and Percy. And yet here she was in this place surrounded by electricity. I really think in so many ways, the creature was her trauma incarnate. Percy, despite all of their issues, loved it. And he's the reason why she ended up turning into a full-length book outside of a short story. He saw something in it, obviously, and encouraged her to continue. Now, she was a woman, and this is 1817, I think, at this point. So, you don't have a ton of female authors, and this is a very gruesome book. So she publishes the book anonymously. Her name is not on it, but Percy does write the foreword. It sells 500 copies. It's not a huge success. In fact, critics really criticize it because it's so gruesome. They're not used to this. And why would they be? This is a woman projecting her pain onto a page, and that women's voices at that time were not something people heard. It's horrific in here sometimes, folks. And she's the example of it. But as always, more tragedy is going to follow. Mary and Percy would suffer the loss of 2 more children. Their son Percy is the only one that actually would make it to adulthood. But then their love story also has a tragic ending. 1822, Percy dies very young by drowning. So now Mary Shelley is a widow in her 20s, her early 20s. She doesn't have a lot of money. She does write other novels. It's just literally constant trauma, tragedy after the other. In 1831, she would re-release Frankenstein, and this time she edited it a bit. She took out some of the more gruesome bits. In fact, that is the most commonly circulated version of Frankenstein, her original version. Some of them exist out there. It is a dream of mine to get my hand on an original Frankenstein, an 1817 copy, where it's, exactly how she had originally written it. But that was the copy that made her who she is. That is what became the cult horror legend. It became what we all know as Frankenstein. And I don't know, I find it, Frankenstein, the face of Frankenstein is a man. It's a male monster. But for me, everything about that story is female. And I think the reason why I say female is because this is the 1800s. She is a female. She was born into a world in which she was seen as other, yet she was meant to exist. She didn't ask to be brought in, but she had to be. She was constantly seeking the love of a man that wouldn't give it to her, or it was in a weird, manipulative, almost abusive way. It's impossible to not draw the parallels between the monster and Mary, because to me, they are one and the same. And I think so many women of that time would have identified with the monster, with the creature. What's beautiful about Frankenstein is it's this tragic love story wrapped in a horror story. Like, you are literally creating a monster, a creature out of death, and it shouldn't feel anything. It's the furthest thing from human, yet its emotions are the most human. She wrote one of the most human stories that exists, and that's why 2 centuries later, we are still reinventing her story. The woman invented science fiction. She is a pioneer when it comes to genre, when it comes to horror. And I just wish we talked more about the origins of this story, because it's a story that so many of us can relate to. So whether it's, Boris Karloff's version or the book that you love, Frankenstein is a legend and a horror cult classic for a reason. So thanks, guys, for picking this for me to talk about. And I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it felt spooky and festive and we're kicking off the season right. This is going to be a blast. I can't believe how interesting the history is on so many of our favorite horror stories. So yeah, folks, grab a glass. Follow me on Instagram if you want to partake in the voting process. Us creeps love getting more creeps. So come join the family. Happy spooky season, folks. Chin chin.